Hi guys, this is Hamid. Welcome back to my channel. Now in this video we'll be talking about how to get the most of your video settings when shooting video. Now if you are new to videography or you're starting out, or you could even be a professional, no matter what your level of background skill is, you might find this video very useful. So without further ado, let's get started. Now the first things first, what we want to do is we want to bump down the camera settings to manual exposure. Now this is very important because what happens is when you're doing automatic exposure, you're relying on the camera to do all the automatic stuff for you, and sometimes that won't turn out to be perfect. So always remember to set your camera on manual exposure. This will give you full flexibility of creating manual exposure all under your hands rather than relying under the camera. So if you are using the Sony a7R III just like I am, you can find it very easily. I mean, all cameras should have this, so that shouldn't be an issue. The next thing we want to talk about here is our shutter speed. Now with the shutter speed, there is a rule of thumb here, so depending on what frame rate you're shooting at, your shutter speed should be double that amount. So let me give you an example. If you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be double that, so 50 frames per second. If you're shooting at, let's say, 120 frames per second, your shutter speed should be double that amount, so 250 in this case, or 240, close to that mark. So always remember to do this because it does make a difference. So say, like for example, if your shutter speed is too slow compared to the frame rate, you're going to get this choppy footage and it's not going to look good. Or if you go too high than the frame rate, what happens is you're going to get this unnatural look in your video and it's not going to look right. It's just going to become all choppy footage and it's not going to look right. You won't get that cinematic feel in your video. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Now the other thing is the aperture. Now when setting the aperture, this is the most important thing. Now sometimes if you look at this chart over here, basically if you look at this chart here, many people get confused about the aperture and how it works, because if you're looking at this chart, you can see f1.4, what happens is the blades of the lens opens up wider. Now many people get confused by this. The reason being is f1.4, you would think that because it's a lower number, the lens hole is going to open slightly because it's a lower number, and the higher number, in this case f32, that would open up more wider due to the number being higher. But in this scenario, it works the other way around. It works completely the opposite. So looking at this chart again, f1.4, what happens is the blade of the lens opens wider. So in other words, you're letting more light in, and not only this, when you're letting more light in, you're going to find that you'll get a good bokeh, meaning that the background would blur more. Whereas if you go to f3.2, f32, you're going to find everything is in focus, the background, the subject, which means the blade of the lens is opening up slow, with a little gap, and there's less light coming in. So always keep that in mind because many people get confused about this. Now if you are going out on a shoot, it's always good to get a printout of this sheet and take it with you whenever you're shooting. I will leave links in the bottom of the page where you can actually print this out. It is very useful for when you're going out shooting, unless you can memorize this table from the top of your head, then you have no problem. That being said, there are situations where if you shoot at f1.4, I have seen certain scenarios, it's even happened to me, where if you're shooting a model, for example, you might find that the model's eyes are in focus but the nose is kind of blurred out. So keep that in mind. If that's the situation, I would recommend you play around with the f-stop. Usually I would shoot something in between, so let's just say for example f.4, something around those lines, so you want everything sharp. that's just one thing to keep in mind. Now, when I go out shoot buildings or stuff like that, I do sometimes use the f.4, or in certain scenarios I might use the f1.4, just so that I can get that blurry background and create that bokeh, if that makes sense. Now, with that being said, also keep in mind that when you've got everything perfect, so you follow the rule of your shutter speed being above the double the amount of the frame rate, as I mentioned before, you might be following this rule, your ISO is perfect. Always remember, whilst we're on the subject ISO, always remember that when you're shooting in daylight scenarios, always keep the ISO low as possible. So when I shoot in daylight scenarios, I would recommend 100 or nothing above 200. If I go too high, so let's just say, for example, I'm shooting 800 ISO or double that, 1600, you're gonna find that there's a lot of grain in your image. So always try to keep the ISO low as possible, because you know, in daylight always shoot at 100 frames per second, 100 ISO, nothing above 200. That's how I would do it anyway. Now, it can be quite tricky when you're using shooting in low light situations. Reason being is because you've got less light coming in, and your aperture, you have to lower down the aperture. So as I mentioned before, you have to keep the blade number high. Always keep the blade number high, so that way, because when you're working with low light situations, it can be tricky. Now, for those who follow me on social media, you will notice that I specialize in low light portrait. So I shoot in low light portrait, and that's very difficult because it's very challenging shooting in low light conditions. So because your ISO has to be perfect, your aperture and all of that. But when you're shooting video, it can be extra challenging because you have the frame rates to think about as well. So all of that. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, so when you might find that everything is perfect, your ISO, you follow the rule of keeping your shutter speed double the amount of the frame rate. You might be following all those rules, but however, when you're shooting in daylight, you might find it a bit tricky. You might notice that you're still experiencing maybe not stable footage, maybe you're experiencing more sort of like out of focus kind of footage. Now, there are solutions behind that. So one of the things that you would go about this is maybe cranking up the shutter speed. But with that being said, cranking up the shutter speed, you might lose that kind of like smooth cinematic kind of footage, and it's not going to make your video look good. And the other thing is, you could be aperture, so your f-stop, or you could play around with the ISO. One or the other, you have to play around with them to get the best settings. So as I mentioned before, double the your shutter speed doubles the amount of the frame rate. Now, there are certain scenarios where you can actually break this rule, but I would strongly recommend that you don't break this rule. Stick to this rule in order to get this more smooth cinematic footage. Now, and the other solution can be to invest in some very good ND filters, some variable ND filters. Now, the one that you saw me do a review on in my previous video, so I was doing a review on the CineBloom. Now, always remember that the CineBloom will not solve this problem of darkness and all of that. Reason being is because the CineBloom is very different to a variable ND filter. So let me explain the difference. So the CineBloom is actually for scenarios like this. In fact, I'm actually using the CineBloom filter now as we speak. So it gives the exposures a bit of a bloom, which is where it gets its name from, CineBloom filter. So it's kind of like blooms out the filter, the lights, or in dark situations like this. Whereas a VND, a variable density filter, that basically kind of like, so say for example, if you're shooting water or you're shooting cars, what you do is you kind of twist the variable ND on your lens, and what that'll basically do is it'll get rid of the reflections. So if you're shooting a car, you'll get rid of the reflections of the car. If you're shooting water, you're doing a modeling shoot and there's too many reflections showing up on the water, you just twist the variable ND filter and you'll get rid of that a lot. When you're using a variable ND filter in a highlight situation, so let's just say for example you're doing a video shoot, you're shooting a model, and the model is in a very highlight condition, so the sun is gleaming onto the model. What the variable ND filter will also do is if you twist it onto the lens, you'll have more control over the light. What I also want to add is when you're working indoors, if you're shooting video indoors, you can get very creative. So for example, I've already mentioned I'm using the CineBloom filter, so that's like a extra addition, so it'll make the exposures bloom out. So over here I'm using the one light grid setup. It's basically the MK2. I am using the daylight Mark II. I will leave a card over on above the screen so you can click on. And when I say you can get creative indoors, as I mentioned, I am using one light setup with the grid diffusion, a double diffusion grid, so it's giving me that soft light. And when I say you can get creative, let me show you. So at the back I can use the RGB light, which I've recently done a video on. So let me show you what it looks like with the RGB light on. There you have it, guys. So this is what I mean by when I say you can get more creative. I've got the RGB light on my bed in the background here, so now it's kind of separating my arm from the background. The subject separates from the background. So this is what I mean by getting more creative. So if you haven't got any extra lights, these RGB lights are perfect for background videos and that kind of stuff. I mean, look how beautiful it stands out. Now bear in mind, because it's a RGB light, I can actually change colors on this as well, so I can get even more creative. So if you don't have any variable ND filters, now is the best time to purchase some, because you can get them very cheap. There's all kinds of options, and the RGB light is a must for indoor talking head videos, just like I'm doing now. And let me show you the different colors that I can do. There guys, now look at the different colors that it's giving me in the background. Now notice these colors are actually switching from one color to another. You can actually have them as a still, so they won't be changing. So for example, earlier on I had the blue color, and here I've got the green color, so you can see you can get very creative. So anyway guys, that wraps it up. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the comments box below, and if you do want me to check out your work, feel free to send it through. I'll leave my social media links at the bottom in the comment box. And also do check out my website guys, because I do specialize in low light cinematic portraits, so you might find that interesting. And if you are new to this channel, I have been featured in many different magazines in the UK. Amateur Photographer magazine, where I won the photo of the week. I've also appeared in Digital Photographer magazine, Photo Plus magazine, many more. You'll see that on my website. So anyway guys, that wraps it up for this video. If you did like this video and you did learn something, please give me a thumbs up, smash that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys on the next video. Thank you for watching.